You know that moment when you're talking to someone you're attracted to and the conversation feels good, comfortable even, but something's missing. You're stuck in friend zone territory. The energy is flat, platonic, safe, and you can feel the romantic possibility slipping away with every passing minute of small talk about work, weather, or weekend plans. You're not alone in this. Most people never learn how to shift a conversation from casual to romantic, and they spend their entire dating lives wondering why they always end up in the friend zone despite being interesting, attractive, and genuinely good people. Here's what nobody tells you. The difference between a conversation that leads to romance and one that leads to nowhere has nothing to do with your looks, your job, or even how funny you are. It has everything to do with frames. Frames are the invisible psychological containers that shape how every interaction is interpreted. When you meet someone, there's an unspoken negotiation happening beneath the surface of your words. You're both establishing frames, testing frames, and either accepting or rejecting the frames the other person offers. And here's the crucial part that changes everything. The person who controls the frame controls the direction of the relationship. Machiavelli understood this 500 years ago when he wrote about power dynamics and influence. While everyone else was focused on brute force and obvious displays of dominance, Machiavelli recognized that true power comes from shaping perception and controlling the frame of reality itself. The same principle applies to romantic interactions. You don't need to be the most attractive person in the room. You don't need to have the perfect life or the perfect words. You need to master frame control. And more specifically, you need to master frame stacking. Frame stacking is the art of layering multiple psychological frames on top of each other until the person you're talking to naturally sees you through a romantic lens rather than a platonic one. It's not about tricks or manipulation. It's about consciously directing the conversation in a way that creates emotional depth, sexual tension, and romantic possibility. Most people stumble through conversations hoping romance will spontaneously emerge. Frame stackers engineer it deliberately, ethically, and effectively. Let's start with the foundation. The first frame you need to establish is what we'll call the selection frame. This is where you subtly communicate that you're someone who has options and standards, not someone who's grateful for any attention they can get. Most people approach conversations from a frame of hoping to be chosen. They present themselves, wait for approval, and try to prove their worth. This immediately positions them as lower value in the dynamic. The selection frame flips this completely. Here's how it sounds in practice. Early in the conversation, when they mention something about themselves, you respond with a statement that implies evaluation. If they tell you about their job and they seem passionate about it, you might say something like, "I can tell you actually care about what you do." That's rare. Most people I meet are just going through the motions. Notice what just happened. You didn't compliment them desperately. You didn't ask them 20 follow-up questions to keep them talking. You made an observation that implies you've met many people, you have standards for what impresses you, and they're meeting those standards. This creates a subtle but powerful shift. They're no longer just talking to someone who's interested. They're talking to someone whose interest matters. The selection frame works because it taps into a fundamental principle of human psychology. We value what we have to work for. We're attracted to people who seem selective because their approval feels meaningful. When you establish early on that you notice things, that you have opinions about people, and that not everyone passes your filter, you immediately elevate your perceived value. But here's the key. This only works if it's genuine. If you're faking selectivity while secretly desperate for their approval, they'll sense the incongruence and the frame will collapse. Frame control requires internal alignment. Once you've established the selection frame, you stack the second layer, which is the assumption frame. This is where you start speaking to them as if romantic interest is already assumed rather than something you're trying to create. Most people ask permission for escalation. Can I get your number? Would you want to go out sometime? Do you find me attractive? Every question like this hands power to the other person and puts you in a position of seeking approval. The assumption frame eliminates this dynamic entirely. Here's what it looks like. Instead of asking if they'd like to continue the conversation later, you say something like, "We should continue this over coffee. I have a feeling we'd get into trouble if we kept talking here." Notice the shift. You're not asking permission. You're stating an intention and inviting them to join you in it. You're assuming they're enjoying this as much as you are. And more importantly, You're framing the future interaction as something exciting, slightly dangerous, and definitely not platonic. The word trouble does specific work here. It's playful, it hints at mischief, and it plants the seed that whatever is happening between you isn't entirely innocent. The assumption frame works because it bypasses the logical mind and speaks directly to emotion. When you assume attraction exists, you force them to either accept that frame or explicitly reject it. And here's the fascinating part. Most people, when presented with a confident assumption of mutual interest, will accept the frame rather than create the social awkwardness of rejecting it, especially if they're even somewhat attracted to you. You're not tricking them. You're simply creating a reality where romantic possibility is the default setting rather than something that needs to be carefully negotiated. Now we add the third layer, the depth frame. This is where most people fail completely. They stay on the surface, they talk about safe topics, they exchange information, they're pleasant, and they wonder why there's no chemistry. Chemistry doesn't come from information exchange. Chemistry comes from emotional resonance, and emotional resonance requires depth. The depth frame is about steering the conversation away from surface level small talk and toward topics that reveal who someone really is. Here's a specific script you can use to shift into depth. When the conversation is flowing but still superficial, you interrupt the pattern with something like this. Can I ask you something real? What's something you believe that most people would think is strange? Or alternatively, what's something you're working on in your life right now that actually matters to you? These questions do several things simultaneously. First, they signal that you're not satisfied with surface level interaction. Second, they give them permission to be authentic rather than performative. Third, they create an immediate sense of intimacy because deep questions are typically reserved for people we already trust. The depth frame works because it creates what psychologists call self-disclosure reciprocity. When you invite someone to share something real and you receive it without judgment, they feel seen and understood in a way that's rare in casual conversation. This creates a bond. But here's the crucial part. You can't just ask deep questions and then judge their answers or fail to reciprocate. Frame stacking requires you to be genuinely curious, genuinely open, and willing to share your own depth in return. The frame only holds if both people are participating in creating something meaningful. After establishing depth, you layer in the fourth frame, which is the tension frame. This is where you deliberately introduce playful challenge, teasing, or slight disagreement. Most people think being agreeable and nice is the path to attraction. It's not. Agreement is boring. Harmony is forgettable. Tension is magnetic. The tension frame creates a push-pull dynamic that keeps the other person slightly off balance in the most delicious way possible. Here's what tension sounds like. They say something about themselves, and instead of nodding along supportively, you playfully challenge it. If they tell you they're an organized person, you might smile and say, "I don't believe you." Organized people don't usually advertise it. "I think you're secretly a beautiful mess pretending to have it together." This creates immediate tension. They'll either laugh and admit you're right, or they'll defend themselves and try to prove their organizational skills. Either way, you've created a dynamic. You've given them something to react to. You've made yourself memorable. The tension frame works because it creates what's called arousal misattribution. When someone feels a spike of emotion, whether it's from being challenged, teased, or playfully provoked, their nervous system creates physiological arousal, increased heart rate, heightened awareness, energy. And here's the fascinating part. The brain often misattributes that arousal to attraction. They think they're feeling chemistry when what they're actually feeling is the excitement of someone who isn't treating them like everyone else does. You're not being mean, you're not being cruel. You're being playfully challenging in a way that signals confidence and creates emotional spikes. Now we get to the fifth frame, which is the exclusivity frame. This is where you create a sense that what's happening between you is special, rare, and not something you do with everyone. Most people try to seem universally likable. They're friendly to everyone. They share the same stories with everyone. They're consistent and predictable. The exclusivity frame does the opposite. It creates the feeling that the connection you're building is unique. Here's how you build it. You say things like, "I don't usually tell people this, or there's something about you that makes me want to be honest," or "I wasn't planning on staying this long." but this conversation is actually interesting. Each of these statements does something powerful. It suggests that you're making an exception, that you're letting them see a side of you that isn't public, that they've earned access to something others haven't. This creates a sense of specialness that amplifies attraction. The exclusivity frame works because humans are hardwired to value scarcity. If you treat everyone the same way, your attention and energy feel abundant and therefore less valuable. If you make someone feel like they're getting a version of you that others don't see, suddenly your attention becomes precious. But again, this only works if it's genuine. You can't fake specialness. You have to actually be selective about who you open up to and create real moments of vulnerability with people who deserve it. The sixth frame is the future projection frame. This is where you casually mention future interactions as if they're already decided. Most people end conversations hoping for a future but not daring to assume one. The future projection frame makes plans feel inevitable rather than hopeful. You're not asking if they want to see you again. You're mentioning what you'll do together next time. Here's the language pattern. Next time we hang out, we should. Or when we continue this conversation. Or I'm definitely cooking for you at some point. You seem like someone who would appreciate real food. Each of these statements assumes continued contact. It bypasses the question of whether there will be a next time and jumps straight to what that next time will look like. This creates a psychological commitment. Once someone has accepted the frame that future interactions will happen, they're far more likely to follow through. The future projection frame works because of something called consistency bias. Once we've accepted an idea or agreed to a framework, we tend to act in ways that are consistent with that acceptance. When you talk about the future as if it's certain, you're inviting them to step into that certainty with you. And unless they explicitly reject it, they're implicitly accepting it. You're creating momentum toward continued connection without having to awkwardly negotiate it. The seventh and perhaps most important frame is the calibration frame. This is where you pay attention to how they're responding to everything else and adjust accordingly. Frame stacking is not a rigid script you force onto someone regardless of their reactions. It's a dynamic dance where you lead but remain attuned to your partner. The calibration frame means you're constantly reading the room, noticing what lands, what creates positive energy, and what might be pushing too far. Here's what calibration looks like in practice. If you introduce tension with playful teasing and they seem uncomfortable rather than engaged, you immediately soften and add warmth. If you project a future interaction and they seem hesitant, you back off and give them space rather than pushing harder. If depth questions make them light up and become animated, you lean further into meaningful conversation. Frame control is not about domination. It's about leadership, and good leaders remain responsive to the people they're leading. The calibration frame works because it demonstrates emotional intelligence and genuine care for the other person's experience. Anyone can mindlessly apply techniques. Someone who's truly skilled at frame stacking pays attention, adapts, and ensures that both people are enjoying the dynamic being created. This is what separates ethical influence from manipulation. Manipulation ignores the other person's comfort and consent. Ethical influence creates space for both people to step into something enjoyable together. Now, here's where it all comes together. Frame stacking is not about applying these 7 frames in order like a checklist. It's about weaving them together naturally throughout the conversation so that by the time you've been talking for 20 or 30 minutes, you've established yourself as selective, assumed mutual attraction, created emotional depth, introduced playful tension, made them feel special, projected a future together, and remained calibrated to their responses. When all of these frames are stacked properly, the conversation naturally shifts from platonic to romantic without anyone having to explicitly announce it. Think about it like this. Imagine 2 conversations happening side by side. In the first conversation, someone is being nice, asking polite questions, agreeing with everything said, hoping to be liked, and eventually awkwardly asking for a phone number. In the second conversation, someone is evaluating the other person with genuine curiosity, assuming connection rather than asking for it, going deep instead of staying safe, creating playful tension instead of bland harmony, making the other person feel uniquely seen, casually mentioning future adventures together, and adjusting their approach based on what's working. Which person seems more attractive? Which interaction feels more alive? The answer is obvious. The second person is operating from a completely different paradigm. They're not hoping for romance to happen. They're actively constructing the conditions that make romance inevitable. This is what Machiavelli understood about power and what applies perfectly to romantic dynamics. The person who shapes the frame shapes the outcome. But here's what you need to understand on a deeper level. Frame stacking only works if you're internally aligned with the frames you're projecting. You cannot successfully project selectivity if you're internally desperate. You cannot successfully assume attraction if you're terrified of rejection. You cannot create depth if you're defended and surface level yourself. You cannot introduce tension if you're afraid of conflict. You cannot make someone feel special if you don't feel secure in your own value. The frames are not masks you wear. They're expressions of how you actually see yourself and the world. This means that mastering frame stacking is ultimately about personal development. It's about becoming someone who genuinely has standards, someone who genuinely believes in their own value, someone who can genuinely go deep, someone who can genuinely handle tension, someone who genuinely makes others feel seen. If you try to use these frames as tricks without doing the internal work, people will sense the incongruence and the frames will collapse. But if you develop yourself into someone who naturally embodies these qualities, frame stacking becomes effortless. So here's your practical starting point. The next time you're in a conversation with someone you're attracted to, don't think about getting them to like you. Think about evaluating whether you like them. This simple shift in focus activates the selection frame automatically. Then, instead of asking permission to continue the interaction, assume they want to continue it and speak from that assumption. Move the conversation toward real topics that matter rather than safe small talk. Introduce light, playful challenges instead of constant agreement. Make them feel like this conversation is different from the others they've had. Mention something you'll do together in the future. And throughout all of it, pay attention to how they're responding and adjust accordingly. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to memorize scripts. You just need to shift from hoping to be chosen to confidently leading the frame of the interaction. When you do this, something remarkable happens. People stop seeing you as just another person they talk to. They start seeing you as someone who made them feel something, someone who created an experience, someone they want to see again. And that's when conversations naturally turn romantic. The reality is that most people spend their entire dating lives being passive. They wait for chemistry to strike. They hope the other person will make things romantic. They're terrified of being too forward or too much. And because of this passivity, they miss opportunity after opportunity with people who would have been interested if someone had simply led the interaction with confidence and skill. Frame stacking gives you the tools to stop being passive and start being intentional about creating the romantic connections you want. Now, I want to be clear about something important. These techniques are powerful, and with power comes responsibility. You should only use frame stacking with people you're genuinely interested in and who seem to be enjoying the interaction. If someone is clearly uncomfortable or uninterested, no amount of frame control will change that, and trying to push past their boundaries is not only ineffective, but unethical. Frame stacking amplifies existing potential. It doesn't create attraction where none exists. Use these tools to enhance genuine connections, not to manipulate people into situations they don't want. With that said, when used ethically with people who are receptive, frame stacking transforms your dating life. You'll stop ending conversations wondering if there was potential. You'll stop getting stuck in the friend zone with people you're attracted to. You'll stop feeling powerless in your romantic interactions. Instead, you'll walk into conversations knowing that you have the skill to shape them in the direction you want them to go. You'll create chemistry where others create comfort. You'll generate attraction where others generate friendship. You'll turn ordinary conversations into opportunities for genuine romantic connection. This is the power that comes from understanding frames and learning to stack them deliberately. It's the difference between hoping something happens and making something happen. It's the difference between leaving your romantic life to chance and taking ownership of it. And it's the difference between being someone who wonders why they're always in the friend zone and being someone who consistently creates romantic connections with people they're genuinely excited about. So take this information and put it into practice. Don't just read about frame stacking. Start doing it. Test these frames in real conversations. Notice what happens when you shift from asking permission to assuming interest. Pay attention to how people respond when you go deep instead of staying safe. Watch what happens when you introduce playful tension instead of constant agreement. And most importantly, do the internal work to become someone who naturally embodies these frames rather than someone who's faking them. If you found this valuable and you want to continue developing your understanding of attraction, influence, and social dynamics, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future content. And leave a comment below sharing which frame resonates most with you or which one you're going to start applying first. I read every comment and I'm genuinely curious about your experiences as you start implementing these concepts in your own conversations. Now go out there and start stacking frames,